you're right. I mean, the other one was my favorite song about God killing all the gods. But I thought maybe you'd heard enough of that. When you see a cloud rising in the west, you say, it's going to rain, and it happens. When you see the south wind blowing, you say, scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites. Frauds, whatever. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky. Why don't you know how to interpret the present time? I know it's hard, and it doesn't feel like a nice summer morning. Last week, Michael Franti, the performer, was in town. So here's a little Michael Franti poetry/music, and I'm not going to rap this. You're welcome. I would be probably the only person who would be sued by Michael Franti for ruining his music. A revolution never comes with a warning. A revolution never sends you an omen. A revolution just arrives like the morning. Ring the alarm, we come to wake up the snoring. They're telling you to worry about the future. They tell you never worry about the torture. Spend it all today and we'll bill you tomorrow. Three-piece suits and bank accounts in Bahamas. Wall Street crime never sends you to the slammer. Tell all the children in the arms of their mamas. The F-15 is a homicide bomber. TV commercials for a popping pill culture. Drug companies circling like a vulture. Iraqi babies with G.I. Joe fodder. 10 years from now, is anyone going to bother? Yell fire. I came to bring fire on the earth, says Jesus, and I wish it was already kindled. This is not the Jesus that we really like, is it? One of the best and most hopeful titles for Jesus is Prince of Peace. Now, the early Christians stole that from the emperor. The emperor is the Prince of Peace. The emperor is the Son of God. The emperor is the Redeemer of the world who comes and rescues everyone and brings the kind of peace that comes only at the point of a sword. And early Christians stole that. Stealing is a Christian virtue. Stealing from evil is a Christian virtue. Never forget that. When it becomes this ethical dilemma, is it right to steal from evil? Yes, it is.
Amen.
They stole that title. The writer of the book of Ephesians tells his readers, have your feet shod with the shoes of the gospel of peace. Shoes of the gospel of peace. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, says, blessed are the peacemakers, and they are so blessed that they become, by their acts of making peace, the offspring of God. That's pretty profound, isn't it? So what do we do with this Jesus? This Jesus in Luke chapter 12, who seems very different. This Jesus who comes to light a fire on the earth. This Jesus whose presence means division and the huge list of examples. Well, this person will not be for this person, and this person won't be for this person, and this person, and this person, and that person. And I don't know that Jesus is speaking to his desire, or if he's speaking to what reality is. I have a feeling it's the second. I have a feeling he's talking about what the reality is. That bringing the gospel of peace into the world often results in this kind of conflict. It's not always appreciated. It's not always liked. He says, I'm about to be baptized with this baptism, and I want it to happen. This baptism of death and resurrection. This baptism of forcing this new world into being. This world that doesn't exist yet. Into being. Jesus really and truly believed that judgment was coming, resurrection was coming, that when all of the dead would be resurrected, some would be judged as not having done the right things, and they would be destroyed. Not sent to hell forever, but just back to dead. And then some would be resurrected to live the life of the ages. Maybe not eternal, maybe not forever, maybe there's something coming after the life to come, but they'd be resurrected, and they would live in this new sort of way, this new kind of being. This is an apocalyptic passage. It begins, Luke chapter 12 starts with this multitude of people hanging out, watching Jesus. There are so many people, Luke says, that they started to trample each other. And interestingly enough, Jesus doesn't say, hey, everyone calm down. He starts telling them these wild things that are going to happen, that he thinks are on their way. And we're not reading, if we thought we were reading the unmediated words of Jesus, we might say that all of this stuff that he's saying feels very disjointed. It feels like the ravings of a street preacher. Have you ever had the pleasure of sitting and listening to a street preacher? You've been accosted by a street preacher, and you start to follow, and then all of a sudden you're lost. And then you pick up the thread again, and then it goes somewhere else. And this is almost what this feels like. But these are not unmediated words. I'm one of those people that thinks that a lot of what we have in the Gospels are the words of Jesus, or at least very much like the words of Jesus. Because I think Jesus said the same things over and over and over again. But they aren't unmediated. Someone took the trouble of writing this stuff down. They put this into a kind of context that wasn't just for the original hearers of these words. These are words that were intended for people like you and me, people living 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 2,000 years after these words were spoken. And they're supposed to somehow provide some kind of context for living. So fathers against sons and mothers against daughters is the reality that some of these people found themselves living in. But there's great intention, I think, in the way Jesus gets presented. I think there's great intention in the way Jesus presents himself. I think that these words really reflect the way Jesus saw the divine and saw the future and saw the present, even as those words get shifted slightly so that they speak into different and other contexts and situations. Last week I talked a little bit about this word biblical, or this idea of Bible believing, and I said, I have run into people who say, do they preach the Bible at that church? And I think, maybe, I hope so. At least we talk about it. Being biblical or Bible believing or Bible preaching. Well, here's another one. Have you ever heard people talk about the God of the Bible? The God of the Bible does this. Or, have you ever heard or said, and I know the answer for some of you, have you ever heard or said, there's a difference between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament? How many of you have said that? You're heretics. One of the first heresies that's identified is this heresy of a guy named Marcion, lived in the late 2nd century. He's the first person to put together a New Testament. He gathered the letters of Paul, and I think the Gospel of John. And then he did a Thomas Jefferson move, and he cut out the parts he didn't like. And he copied it back down again. Any part that referred to the God of the Old Testament in a positive way, any part that referred to Jews in a positive way, out the window. Marcion was nothing if not an anti-Semite. And the rest of the church said, to their credit, no, we are not anti-Semites. Thank you very much. We'll wait a couple centuries before we become anti-Semites. Actually, you know what's interesting is that after I said that, I felt like I got a little teary about that. I'm sad that that's the reality. But they said no thank you to that, because they said there is some continuity between this character that we encounter in the Hebrew Scriptures and this reality that we encounter in our lives right now. There is some continuity. But even still, if we say the God of the Old Testament, what exactly are we talking about? Because we see this interesting transformation. We see lots of different names for God. Yahweh, El Shaddai. El Shaddai, by the way, could mean God of the mountains or God of the breasts. A breasted God. What does that mean? A maternal God. You have Elyon, this ancient God. But all of these names, Elohim, they all kind of mix together and become our vision of what we say the God of the Old Testament is. But no one living in the Old Testament really knew what that meant. We're talking about a tradition that spanned 1,000 years. It was sort of written down and edited and worked on over 400 years. Who are we talking about? And I think it's unfortunate maybe that we use the word God to refer to deities and the word God to refer to the numinous. When I was in seminary, I heard, I had read a prayer, read a prayer. This is embarrassing. That was read either from the Aztec or from the Inca. And that's like saying, I heard a prayer that was either written in China or ancient Greece. I'm not exactly sure. These are disconnected, but they were on the American continents somewhere. And this was a prayer to the sun. And at the end of the prayer it says, and if there is a God beyond the sun, then this prayer is to that God. That catches what I think we're looking at. There is a God beyond God. And when we say God and we refer to deities, we actually are trying to move toward a God that is even beyond theism. And I don't mean that it moves us into atheism, but it moves us past theism, a God who operates outside of what we think we mean by godness. And you see that happening in both the Christian tradition and even in the Jewish tradition, in the Hebrew scriptures. You watch that happening. Because there's not one universal picture of the Old Testament God. This is Paul Tillich. He was a 20th century theologian. The God above God is the object of all mystical longing. But mysticism also must be transcended in order to reach God. Mysticism does not take seriously the concrete and the doubt concerning the concrete. That is to say, your experience, your life. It doesn't take your life seriously enough, and it doesn't take the doubt you bring into your life seriously enough. It plunges directly into the ground of being and meaning and leaves the concrete, the world of finite values and meanings behind. So it doesn't solve the problem of meaninglessness. Even mysticism doesn't get you there. It doesn't move you toward this God who is beyond gods. Because we live in this concrete world. We live in this world of reality. So, Isaiah's great parable of the vineyard. My beloved, my lover, planted a vineyard. And he did these things, right? And he looked for good grapes, and he found, well, I guess garbage grapes, wild grapes, not good grapes. So what am I supposed to do? I mean, the obvious thing is to tear down the whole thing and get rid of it. And then move past being just a vine keeper and tell the clouds not even to rain on this. Let wild animals come in and eat the whole thing. That sounds like the Old Testament God, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound like what you mean when you say the God of the Old Testament, this angry, judgmental, I will destroy everything kind of God? Very, very angry, very upset. This is a warrior God. This name is Yahweh Sabaoth. I am that I am, the commander of the armies. God of hosts is another way to say it. There's all this anger in the story. And the anger isn't that these people neglected their religious duties. Yahweh Sabaoth is angry because they have neglected the needy. I looked for justice and I saw bloodshed. I looked for righteousness and I heard a cry. Now, that's a little bit of wordplay. The word for justice, mishpat, sounds like the word for bloodshed. And the word for righteousness, tzedakah, sounds like the word for crying out in pain or in anguish. Whatever else we think the God of the Old Testament is all about, the God of the Old Testament is always on the side of the needy, always on the side of the oppressed, always on the side of the poor, always on the side of the marginalized. Whatever else you can say about this multiplicity of names, this multiplicity of presentations, this multiplicity of judgments, this God cares about the marginalized. And Jesus comes along and cares about the marginalized as well. Mishpat. Retributive justice, right? And a person like me, who is a prison abolitionist, doesn't like the idea of retribution, because it seems like retribution never works. You did something wrong to me, so I'm going to do something wrong to you. And then what happens, right? And then Gandhi comes along, and what does he say about eyes? An eye for an eye, what does it do? It makes everybody blind. It doesn't work. And yet, you read Jesus is longing for this apocalypse, this messianic kingdom that comes and turns everything upside down, that tears down thrones and lifts up the oppressed. Sounds like retribution, but we want retribution to not be the end. We want retribution perhaps to be the beginning. We want retribution to apply to everyone, because it doesn't ever apply to people on Wall Street. It doesn't ever apply to the powerful. It doesn't ever apply to the wealthy. But when you think about apocalypse, when you think about the first becoming last and the last becoming first, if you think about the hope of resurrection, if you think about this chaotic reordering so that thrones are torn down, so that the least are lifted up. It makes you wonder if this God who is beyond God creates meaning out of meaninglessness. It makes you wonder if Alfred North Whitehead's God, who is the fellow sufferer who understands, really does understand. It makes you wonder if retribution has some kind of connection to restitution and reparations and repatriation and a bunch of other R words. This is, I think, what the Lord of hosts in Isaiah is frustrated at, wants to see happen. All those things can begin to coalesce and begin to make meaning in the meaninglessness, begin to make meaning in the concrete way of living. And then tzedakah, it's TZ, tzedakah, righteousness. I had to read Rabbi Jonathan Sacks to try to understand this. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was the chief rabbi of Orthodox synagogues in Great Britain for about 20 years. He was also a lord, so he's very British, right? But also very Jewish. And he says that tzedakah really can't be translated. It's not really righteousness. He says it can't be translated because it takes two things that are opposites or different from one another and puts them in conversation, puts them in tension, puts them in this paradox. And if you want to understand spirituality, anytime you encounter a paradox, you should run toward that, not away from it, because it will make you live and think differently. He says it takes this idea of justice and this idea of compassion and forces them together. Now here's the example that he gives. Again, he's a British person. Suppose, and I'm not going to do an accent, although perhaps I should. Suppose, for example, that I gave someone 100 pounds. Either he is entitled to it or he is not. If he is entitled, then my act is a form of justice. If he is not, it is an act of charity. In English, a gesture of charity cannot be an act of justice, nor can an act of justice be described as charity. Tzedakah is therefore an unusual term because it means both. It pulls everything together. And he says that that is based on this distinction in Jewish theology that I think Christian theology lacks, mostly because we haven't engaged it enough. The distinction is this: the distinction between possession and ownership. You possess many things. If you were deeply Christian or deeply Jewish, probably deeply Muslim as well, and deeply lots of other things, you would not believe that you could own anything. That is related to the confusion that indigenous people on this continent encountered over land ownership. Yeah, we can all be here. We can have control over this, but how do we own this? How do you own something? How do you own and not possess? How do you just possess and not own? We have these two distinctions. Tzedakah becomes my obligation to you because you are the face of God to me. So, in some sense, I owe you out of what I have. I owe you. What I have is also yours. And what you have also belongs to someone else because you don't own it. You just possess it. You just move it through. Here's a little more Jonathan Sacks. The nearest English equivalent to tzedakah is social justice. And I don't know if some of you are aware, or many of you are aware of, a few years ago, the derogatory slur leveled at many people, you are a social justice warrior, or SJW, for sure. And I always found that very ironic that you could think you're hurting someone's feelings by calling them a warrior for social justice. Because that, if there is any commonality to the depictions of God in the Old Testament and the depictions of God in the New Testament and the person of Jesus, social justice warrior seems to be the closest thing we can attach to the person of God and God, beyond God, the numinous, the call that we are invited into. The nearest English equivalent to tzedakah is social justice. No one should be without the basic requirements of existence, and those who have more than they need must, he didn't say should, he says must, share some of that surplus with those who have less. This is fundamental to the kind of society the Israelites were charged with creating, namely one in which everyone has a basic right to dignified life and equal worth. That's pretty profound. I find that very profound. He goes on to say that it's, even if you are a recipient of tzedakah, if you are a recipient of social justice, if you are a recipient of the kind of charity that is rooted in obligation, you also must perform acts of tzedakah. Because there is something dignifying about giving, just as there is something dignifying about receiving. And there is something profoundly humiliating about receiving, and something profoundly humiliating about giving as well. So that those things are held in paradox, and you become something else. You become transformed. And when I read these words from Jonathan Sacks and meditate on this passage from Isaiah about this vineyard whose disappointment is only in not caring for others, I can't get away from that. And it reminds me of this thing that I've been saying to you and been saying to other people, that we ought to be about solidarity beyond charity. That when we realize that our obligation is toward each other, that this becomes, for Jews at least, this is a duty. It's not just an option. That we live in solidarity with each other. I think about this anarchist insistence that private property, as opposed to personal property, private property, more than you can actually use yourself, is theft. And not the kind of theft that Christians ought to engage in, maybe. The kind of stealing that Christians ought to engage in. Tzedakah can move us out of that way of thinking, that mode of thinking. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? And our culture is filled with weathermen and women and persons. We all know how to diagnose the problem, right? We all know what the problems are. We can all point to them. We all understand, at least conceptually, the issues of climatic change. We all understand the dangers of rising fascism. We all understand the pain that many people in our country and other countries experience over loss of employment, over loss of opportunities, over a decline of living standards in a lot of ways. We all understand what those are. I don't think the critique Jesus is leveling is you don't see what's happening, because Jesus is soaking in his tradition. And he's observing the people around him. The people around him are suffering deeply. The people around him understand that this is not a sustainable way of living. That this way of living as peasants who are oppressed by the Roman Empire is not sustainable. He's not saying you don't see that. He's saying you don't see where things are going. We all intuitively understand what's happening. We all intuitively feel, I think, that the negative elements of apocalypse may be upon us, but we do not draw on the positive elements of apocalypse as well. I think that the church, the movement of Jesus, this cruciform community, this Christocentric community, this community that spends so much time kind of thinking about the person of Jesus, ought to be the most progressive and forward-moving force in the history of the world. And yet the church often is not. The church often hangs back and waits and says, well, hold on, we gotta see what's going to happen first, right? We're not looking at the sky, we're not reading the signs, we're waiting to see what is everyone else going to do. Oh, then we'll get on board with that 50 years later. We'll go ahead and do that. Rather than look, become futurists. And I don't understand that. It's not just conservatives, because liberal Christians are as conservative as anyone else. They pull back as much as anyone else. Sorry, liberal Christians. That's the reality. But the church is called to constantly be watching the horizon. And that's the question for you all to ask yourselves. What is on the horizon? What is just over the edge of the earth? What is coming this way? What are the clouds telling you? Be the ones seeing climate change bearing down on us. And not only that, prepare tzedakah. Prepare ways in which to be in solidarity with your neighbors, with our neighbors, with the future, so that we can be part of alleviating suffering, not encouraging it. Amen?